Hello, and welcome to Emotional Intelligence for Leaders. So, today I'm going to be giving a high level overview of what emotional intelligence is, the components that make up emotional intelligence, and why it's important for leaders to improve their emotional intelligence so they can be an example for their employees, their family, and the world. This is something that I truly feel that everyone needs to kind of focus on, especially in today's climate where high level of emotions are running through companies, through our lives, through our families. And so now more than ever, emotional intelligence is super important. So before I tell you a little bit about myself, I just want to tell you a little bit about what emotional intelligence is. Emotional intelligence is a set of emotional and social skills that collectively establish how well we perceive and express ourselves to each other. It's also how we perceive ourselves to ourselves, which is also very important. It helps us to develop and maintain social relationships, cope with challenges, times of crisis, and use emotional information in an effective and meaningful way. So that's basically just a high level overview of what emotional intelligence is. The difference between EQ and IQ, emotional intelligence is EQ, is that you can improve your emotional intelligence. And I'm not saying that you can't improve your IQ, but you could substantially improve your EQ with work on yourself, with applying the principles of really working on yourself from within and growing as a leader. So it is definitely something that you can see an improvement with. I personally am certified through MHS, which is one of the best emotional intelligence companies on the planet. They're approved by the American Psychology Association. And so they have a very big test that you can take that gives you about a 30-page report about where you are. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. I offer those consultations. It's very fascinating. So before I go any further, I just want to tell you who I am. I am the CEO of the University of Wellness. The University of Wellness is located in Morgantown, West Virginia. That's where our home office is. We have students in 10 countries. We certify in wellness coaching, life coaching, personal training, yoga. And as the CEO, I'm moving more into a leadership role. I have a very big passion for creating leaders. A lot of the things that I have taught in my wellness company are now trending as far as the qualities that leaders are going to have in the future. And so, as I'm moving more into teaching leadership and surrounding myself in the leadership realm, I'm seeing that my worlds are almost coming together. So, I ended up opening another school to separate it a little bit from the wellness school, and that's Brave Business and Leadership School. Brave is my leadership model that I created for my executive doctorate in leadership, which I am currently doing. I have 2 more years. And Brave stands for balance, resilience, authenticity, vulnerability, and emotional intelligence. And while it's a cute little acronym, it's also the future of leadership. If you research the future of leadership, those are the qualities that we're going to be looking for in leaders. And so to get ahead of the curve, we're going to start working on this stuff now. I'm certified in EQ, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, and EQ 360. The difference between 2.0 and 360 is an EQ 2.0 is basically an exam that a leader or an employee, or I consider all of us leaders, whether we're leading ourselves or our families. So it's a private test that you do on yourself, and you get information back on the different composite scales within EQ, which we're going to talk about today, so that you know kind of where you're doing well and where you may need to improve. So companies are doing this for their employees, but leaders are also doing it for themselves as well. The second one is the EQ 360. And with the EQ 360, it's a little bit different because not only do you take the test, but everyone around you takes the test. So you recruit people to take the exam as well on you. So let's just say you're an employee, your coworkers are going to do the test, your boss is going to do the test, and then you're going to really have not just your own perception of self, but how people perceive you in your environment, which is massive. Because I know for me, I may perceive myself a certain way, and other people are going to perceive me completely different than I would ever even expect. So I already mentioned it. I'm getting a doctorate in executive leadership. I will be done in 2 years. And so my research is going to be mostly on the things that you see that I'll be talking about today. But today is going to be mostly focused on what is emotional intelligence and why is it important. So this is the emotional intelligence wheel chart, whatever you want to call it. And so there's 5 composite scales within emotional intelligence. There's stress management, there's self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal decision making. And then as you can see on the outside of this scale, you'll see emotional and social functioning, your well-being, your performance. So the more that we balance and create good experiences emotionally within these composite scales, everything begins to balance out. So I'm going to talk about what each one of them are, but this is how they kind of all play together. When I first took this test, I was actually mind blown by the fact that I had done so well on it, and that was one of the reasons why I was so intrigued. And it made me just really think about how I became so emotionally intelligent. And it's like I've always kind of worked in fast-paced environments where we didn't have a lot of money and we constantly had to be making decisions, and somewhat toxic environments at times. And I think that looking back on my experience, that's why I was able to do that. I'm also a wellness professional and a life coach, so I'm also aware of, how my emotions play on others. But what I was trying to say was, you don't want to just try to have really high self-perception and ignore the rest. You want it to be more balanced. Let me give you an example of something that would be imbalanced. So let's say someone's flexibility is super high. They're really flexible. They can go from one thing to the next. They're just really quick to be able to move through things, and they don't get held up, which is a beautiful quality. However, if their problem solving under decision making is really low, their reality testing is really low, meaning that they don't really solve problems correctly, and they may not see things for what they really are. They could be easily influenced to make flexible decisions based off of something that's not really real. So when we do consultations, which I'll talk about at the end, we want everything to be balanced. So with emotional intelligence, yes, we want to have a high emotional intelligence score, but we want to have a balanced emotional intelligence score. We want these all to be kind of balanced, because another example would be if you have really high self-regard, for example, under self-perception. If your self-regard is just amazing, you love yourself, you think you're great, every decision that you make is great, but your empathy is low, that could lean towards very toxic leadership, because you really can get in a place of, I only care about how I feel and I think my decisions are great, but my empathy is so low that I'm probably not coming off very open to the people that are around me. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm able to share with people in these consultations, that you can see in an emotional intelligence exam. And so just so you know, there's tons of emotional intelligence exams online that you can get for free. I'm not saying anything bad about any of them. I actually haven't tried a whole lot of them, but just some of them are just really more in depth than others, and some are actually approved by the American Psychology Association. So you kind of want to look for one that's got that backing, so that you know that this is like a legit test that's actually giving you accurate information. Okay, so emotional intelligence, what I love about emotional intelligence is there's beginning to be a lot of statistics on how it's changing companies. They're able to see a correlation between the high levels of emotional intelligence in the employees and the sales being higher, or the performance being higher. It really makes a difference. People aren't being caught up in drama all day, and they're really only working 2 hours a day, but they're physically there. Those are the kind of things I've experienced, where it's like something happens and then there's like drama for 8 hours and no one gets anything done. Someone with a high level of emotional intelligence would be able to move through that pretty quickly. It doesn't mean that you don't have emotions. Like, I'm a very emotional person, but I know how to manage those emotions, and I'm aware of how those emotions are coming across. I'm not making a decision based off of those emotions. I'm allowing myself to separate my own personal emotions from the experience that I'm having at work or in my leadership role. So that's really what emotional intelligence is. It doesn't mean that you don't have them. You can have a lot of them. It's actually good if you have emotions because then you care and lead more of a heart-centered type business. So 58% of job performance is actually credited to emotional intelligence. 90% of top performers have high EQ. People with high EQ make $29,000 more annually than their low EQ counterpart. Emotional intelligence is one of the top trends for leaders in 2020, and it continues to resonate across all industries. And I actually made this presentation about 6 months ago, prior to the pandemic and prior to everything that's going on in the country currently. So I see this only rising higher and higher and higher and higher because I feel, especially in crisis, leaders really have to be able to be flexible, change their vision, do whatever they need to do in order to rise above and be able to live through the crisis without allowing it to fall into your lap and just destroying everything in your life and your business. And it's also very important that we're not making impulse decisions, which I saw a lot of impulse decisions based off of a crisis. And then when the crisis kind of winds down, it's actually hurting the company. So all of that plays into emotional intelligence. So I see that number, emotional intelligence, kind of just skyrocketing after all of this. EQ has been found to be the strongest predictor of performance. It explains almost 60% of success in all types of jobs. So unless you're really not dealing with people, EQ is important. But even then, it's like, if you're home by yourself and you're designing websites, having a high level of emotional intelligence is going to be important because you don't want to get sidetracked with irritation and stuff like that, because I've designed stuff before and I know how that goes. So it's good for anyone. So these are the 5 composite scales that make up EQ. So self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal relationships, decision-making, and stress management. And just a second, we're going to go through all of them. But those are basically the 5 things that make up EQ. So as I'm going through this presentation, I just want you to kind of think about maybe where you see that you could do some work on yourself, or maybe where you notice a trend within your company that might need improvement. But I'm just going to be basically explaining to you what each one of these are. So self-perception, pretty self-explanatory. So this is self-regard. This is like how we feel about ourselves. An example of someone with really low self-regard in like a leadership position may have a really difficult time cutting payroll, or terminating employees, or making a change. I'm not saying that those things are like the first thing that we should think about. I'm just saying that a leader who's emotionally intelligent, has high self-regard, isn't going to be constantly questioning their decisions. They're moving through what they need to move through pretty quickly. Yes, they're aware of other people's emotions, but they're also aware of what the business needs, and they're able to handle that and still hold that self-regard and not take everything on personally. So that's kind of what self-regard is. So self-perception overall is your inner self. So this composite is all about how you feel on the inside. It is designed to assess your feelings of inner strength and confidence, persistent in the pursuit of personally relevant and meaningful goals, while understanding what, when, and why, and how different emotions impact thoughts and actions. So that's really your self-perception. I believe if you're watching this and you're an entrepreneur, we have to have a really high level of self-perception, because it's like you're constantly rolling with the punches. I always say entrepreneurship is mastering the art of believing in yourself, because it's like you have to get up and go back, and it comes back to you believing in yourself. So overall self-perception is all about self. So as we already talked about, self-regard, respecting oneself while understanding and accepting one's strengths and weakness. So that's another thing. It's not all about you being perfect. Like for me, just to use me as an example, I know I'm good at teaching. I know I'm good at speaking. I know I'm good at creating content. Am I good at being on social media 3 times a day to make sure that my marketing is out? Am I good at keeping up with organizational stuff? Not so much. And I'm aware that that's where I need support and help. And so the more aware we are of ourself and our self-regard, the more we know what we need and what we don't need. If you have too high of self-regard, but you're bad with the decision making and stuff, which we'll talk about later, you could be not wanting to admit that you have weaknesses. But to me, a strong leader knows what they're strong at and what they're weak at. And they know that not everyone can do every single thing. And there's definitely been a time where I thought I could do everything, and I learned the hard way that that's not the case. So self-regard is definitely an important for a leader. Self-actualization is the willingness to persistently try to improve yourself and engage in the pursuit of personally relevant and meaningful objectives that lead to a rich and enjoyable life. So being in this self-actualization, it's like you know who you are, you know what you want, you know what your purpose is, and if you have the high self-regard, you're also able to know what your weaknesses and strengths are. So self-actualization is also very important. We can have really high self-actualization and really low self-regard, and what would happen in a situation like that is I know my purpose, but I'm going to hide because I don't feel good enough for it. And that happens a lot too with people and situations and employees and leaders, everyone. Emotional and self awareness, which is the third one that goes under self perception, includes recognizing and understanding your own emotions. It includes the ability to differentiate between subtleties in one's emotions while understanding the cause of those emotions and the impact they have on thoughts and actions of oneself and others. So, like I said in the beginning, it's not that you don't have emotions, it's you're aware where they're coming from and you're able to manage those. So, that's where you don't put yourself in certain situations where you're going to be triggered, or you have someone else manage certain things. Like, I'll give you another example. One of the things that we do in business is we create a niche. We create who's our ideal client. And when I first started doing consulting, it was like anybody and everybody. And everyone would tell me I needed a niche, but I didn't listen. And then I finally listened. And one of the reasons was because I personally have built my business from the ground up, from scratch. I have, came back to the drawing board 10,000 times. And I would have people that would come to me for business consulting that wanted to open a business, but it was more like they just had some extra money, or, they thought it was cool. Like, they didn't really have the best of intentions. And the littlest thing, like they would post a Facebook post and not get 500 likes, and they would be ready to quit. And I would leave those consulting sessions and I would feel very irritated. Like it would bring out a part of myself that I didn't necessarily like. So the more I did that, even though I was helpful to them in some capacities, it was causing me to feel emotions that I didn't want to feel. And I didn't think it was fair to them or myself. And so I just stopped working with those type of clients. So I started to do more of a consultation, which most people do, get to know them. And if they were kind of in that I don't know kind of phase when it came to their business, like they didn't even know if they wanted one, those weren't the clients for me. My clients were the people who wanted to fly. They were willing to do the work. They were willing to look at themselves. They were willing to invest. Those are my clients. And so that's being emotionally self-aware. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to get triggered by certain things. It just means that I know that that's probably not where I should be putting my energy. So all of those things in balance will give you a high self-perception. So when I do these tests that I do to kind of give you a scale of where you are on these, like how high your self-regard is, I'll see people with really low emotional self-awareness, but high self-regard. And in those situations, that's kind of like the fixed mentality. What I say is right. So you can see how these all play together. It's a very interesting thing. So we're going to move on to the next composite scale, which is interpersonal. Interpersonal is the ability to develop and maintain relationships based on trust and compassion. You're able to articulate and understand each other's perspectives and where the other person is coming from, and you act responsibly while showing concern for others, their team, or their greater community or organization. So that's so important. I remember always feeling like I just got to be independent. Like that's the goal. Let's be independent. But then there's this layer of interpersonal, and that's kind of where like two independent people are able to interweave and work together. And that's what you want. You want people who have interpersonal skills because they're not going to be like, competing with you and, oh, she can do that. So I have to be able to do that. I can't not know how to do that. It's like, it's okay if you don't, because we all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses, and we can interweave together. So when your interpersonal relationships are high, you're able to develop compassion for others. There's less competitiveness when it comes to the work that's being done. And it just takes away a lot of like petty stuff that none of us have time for. And so empathy is also very important, which I said earlier can actually be bad if you have no self-regard. You're just letting people walk on you. It's all day, you're doing everything for everyone else. Emotional intelligence really makes you take responsibility for who you are and what you're allowing to happen. So someone with a high level of empathy recognizes, understands, and appreciates how other people feel. It involves being able to articulate your understanding of another person's perspective and behaving in a way that is respecting of their feelings. So you may not have ever experienced what they've experienced, but you're able to understand it. And a lot of the times that comes through communication. If we don't communicate with each other, we also don't know what's going on. And that's another thing I see is people just assuming that other people know how they feel, which causes a lot of drama because they really don't. And so empathy really helps you to be able to understand and perceive where the other person is coming from, but you also have to have good communication skills to say what's going on, because if not, you might harbor resentment because you're doing everything. So many people I work with will say like, oh, I'm doing all the work, nobody else is doing anything. And it's like, well, have you asked them to? And they immediately look at me like, no, why would I do? Well, they need to know that you need help. So you have to ask. And I used to be that way too. So I'm definitely not calling anyone out. I'm just bringing awareness to it. So social responsibility is the willingness to contribute to society, to one's social groups, and generally the welfare of others. It involves acting responsibly, having social consciousness, and showing concern for the greater community. As we all know well, this is going to be so important, especially in the times that we're in, that our companies are not just centered around profit and how much money the CEO makes and how great everyone is. It's like we have to be able to give back in some way and be socially responsible in what it is that we're creating, not only for the community, but for ourselves and for the world at large. And so being interpersonal is knowing that, we need to give back and we need to support in ways that, we're not just getting our energy taken from us either. So that's interpersonal. Self-expression. This is kind of going back to what I was just talking about. Self-expression is the ability to ask for what you want, not get, be sitting there irritated because nobody's helping you, but not really asking anyone for help either. And that's also a big thing that I see. You can be the nicest person in the world and do all the things, but if you're not expressing that you're doing it all, or you're not saying no when you need to, it can cause a lot of irritation within yourself. And so that's really what emotional expression is. It's another example of this. I asked one of my employees one time, what did they want to be doing when the new year came around? And I was actually shocked at how hard of a question that was for some people to answer. And it was like that person was so removed from what they wanted because they were so used to doing everything for everyone else that question actually was somewhat triggering for them. And so I highly encourage you, if you are one of those people that kind of just do everything without, asking anyone for help and stuff like that, just know in the end, sometimes it's just hurting you because you're going to lose track of what you want. And sometimes it does kind of create resentment that doesn't need to be there if you would just express that you need help. And so that goes to the assertiveness as well. It's like assertiveness is saying, yes, Mr. Jones, I will 100% take this, mail to the mailbox. I'm using this as an example. However, I'm going to need you to answer the phone while I'm gone, or whatever it is that you need in order to be able to make that happen. So assertiveness is literally standing up for what you believe in a way that is positive. And so that's another thing that kind of goes back to the other things. Let's say you have really high assertiveness and really high self-regard. That can be bad because it's like and then you have low empathy, let's say. You're going to be telling people what you want and you're not going to care how they feel in response. And so that's why I say everything kind of needs to be balanced. So assertiveness is definitely something that we all need to work on. Assertiveness in the way that we ask or tell people how we feel. Like, I love it when I message someone to do something and they say, I'm just going to politely say no. It's just not in my schedule right now. I actually love that because I know that they're doing what's best for them. And then I don't have to feel like I've forced someone to do something that they don't want to do. So if someone asks you to do something and it's not going to affect your job, or, maybe it's outside of your skills or whatever, instead of saying yes just to say yes, which can create more issues, learn how to say no. Or maybe say, can you show me how to do that? I might not know how to do that. I had an employee once that just wanted to show that she knew how to do stuff, but there were some things that she needed to be taught. And so I asked her to do something one time, and I told her I would train her. Well, she wanted to kind of prove that she could do it, and she ended up doing it before I trained her, and it caused like a huge thing in the company. And like literally it was all, I couldn't even like contain it within my little organization. It was like beyond me what had happened. And she was very upset about it because I had to say something to her. And it's like, I understand she wanted to be self motivated and kind of learn, but it's like at the same time, we also need to understand where our weaknesses and things are and express our emotions and not just try to make things happen, because in the long run, it could mess things up. So independence is the ability to work independently, which is great. It's the ability to take on something and go do it. You can be over independent. If your independence is too high and other things are low, you may not want to work in a team. And maybe that person that thinks they're right all the time, or it's only them. So independence can be bad if other things are out of balance. So that is self-expression. Decision making. So decision making obviously is huge. And when emotional intelligence comes into play with decision making, you're not making decisions based off of your own emotions. So let me give you an example of that. And this is like a really crazy example, so I don't suggest anyone do this. But I worked at a company one time and they had to cut, I think it was like $10,000 a month from my budget in my particular department. And in order to do that, they were going to have to get rid of a lot of things that the community needed, that the community loved. And I was kind of like on the fence of whether or not I felt like I even wanted to be there anymore. And I was like the director. And so I said, get rid of me. Why don't you just cut my job? Most people aren't going to say that. So, I credit that to emotional intelligence because it was like, okay, I'm no longer aligned with this. But my logical brain could have been like, well, what about your kids? And what about this? And what about that? I made a decision based off of the fact that I knew it was going to impact the community more if all of these, like they were going to have to get rid of like 1,000 things that the community liked in order to save that money. And I was on the fence of whether I wanted to be there. So I just said, let's cut my position. And that's what happened. And so that's extremely drastic, but that's having the ability to make a decision that's better for everyone else, even if it may hurt you. And, I don't have kids and stuff like that. So it would have been different if that was the case. I had other people to worry about. I just had myself. But in the long run, it's like that's just an example of taking your own emotions and your own needs out of it. But you also don't want to hurt yourself either. So, problem solving is the ability to find solutions to problems in situations where emotions are involved. It includes the ability to understand how emotions impact decision making. Um, Another thing that I see happen is, people may remind you of someone you may have worked with before. We see this in relationships. It's like, you don't really heal from something that happened in a relationship in the past, and now you're taking it into your new relationship. And it's like that kind of happens in the workplace too. Like, oh, this person acts like that person, so you automatically just start to decide things. That's also bringing your emotions into it. So you really want to work on creating good decisions, problem solving in a way that's not coming from a place of emotions. And also, I used to respond to emails really fast, and I had worked one time with someone that was, we kind of had the same personality. It was like he'd come at me, I'd come at him, and it's like I've kind of learned to like sit on emails because it just creates more destruction. So that's also like, we don't have to make impulse decisions to respond to an email that we may regret later. So reality testing, this is also so huge. I found as a leader that this was difficult for me to manage other people whose reality may have been off. And mine may have been too, but my awareness was that they were seeing things different than they really were. So reality testing is if you walk into a convention, and let's say 10 of you walk into a convention, every one of you are going to come out with a different experience. Susie Q might say everybody looked at her funny. John might be like, oh, I was so motivated, everyone was so awesome. Like everyone's going to have a different experience, and it's going to be based off of their emotions. And so I'm the type of leader that I'm an authentic leader. I'll be very honest and upfront, but I do make the best decisions for the company that I'm working for with the reality and the thought process behind I don't want to hurt anyone either. And so I ended up being a boss at a place that was just a free for all until I got there. And I come in and I start making little things to help the company save money. It wasn't anything drastic. And like everyone thought I was like against them. Like I had something out to get them. And then it was like people were starting to become insecure, like thinking it was them. And it was like, in reality, it was like, no, you just had a boss before that really wasn't a boss. And so you're taking everything personally. And so I had to learn how to manage that in a way that was effective. And I also look at myself now too to make sure that I'm not coming off that way. And which is why I like to be authentic and tell people why I'm making decisions. But that's just an example of people's reality, thinking that their reality is real when it's really just a figment of their emotions that are playing out in the job environment or in any environment. So if someone has really low reality testing and they're making decisions, that's not good because they're making decisions based off of something that's probably not even happening. So reality testing, I find, when I'm doing these tests, it's so important to look at that because not a lot of people get that. They don't get that what they think and what they see may not be reality. It's really just how they're feeling in that moment. So this is something definitely that needs to be passed on to employees. So very important. Impulse control is the ability to resist or delay an impulse, drive, or temptation to act. It involves avoiding rash behaviors and decision making. Like for example, I saw a lot of people make really fast decisions when the pandemic started to make sure that they still remained profitable, but they didn't think about what that meant when the pandemic was over. So, for example, some businesses that took themselves completely online that had a really expensive in person business. And now people are used to being online and don't want to go inside. And so it's actually going to end up messing them up because they made too fast of a decision based off of emotions with a lack of impulse control. So all of these things play together. Stress management is obviously how well we can cope with emotions associated with change and unfamiliar and unpredictable circumstances while remaining hopeful about the future and resilient in the face of setbacks. So that's a very hard place to get. It takes a lot of, work to get yourself to be able to just roll with the punches, and your impulse control is low, and like all these things playing together and being balanced is like it's amazing. It's truly amazing to also see how people improve as they do the work on it. So the first one is flexibility, which is adapting emotions, thoughts, and behaviors to unfamiliar, unpredictable, and dynamic circumstances or ideas. So, if you're a new leader going into an organization where no one knows you, that would be a time that you have to be very flexible with the kind of people that you're working with, because they're going to hate you from the minute you come in. Not always, but they're going to have, they're going to have some fear in them. So you have to be flexible, but you also have to be, assertive enough to know, like, hey, I'm here to do a job. I can't just, do what I need to do to make you feel better. Like, this is what I have to do in order to make this place a better place for everyone. So stress tolerance is coping with stressful or difficult situations and believing that one can manage or influence situations in a positive manner. So that's, being in a situation where things are changing rapidly, but also knowing that you can make the best decision in that moment. Before I started the doctorate program, one of the things that kind of turned me off from a doctorate was all this research. I had like this block to it, like, oh, I don't want to research stuff. But now it's like I can make decisions that are not only good for people, but they're actually stats and things behind it and research behind it to make sure that I'm making a correct decision. And so, maybe you have a process and how you respond to things, but that's very important as well. Okay. Optimism. This is funny because I actually took my emotional intelligence test right before I started my doctorate in August. And then I had to take it again when I did my certification to be able to teach this. And my optimism actually went down. My emotional intelligence score overall went up, but my optimism went down. And it was interesting to see how adding a doctorate program to my life actually kind of, made the optimism a little bit lower. I was also dealing with some stuff in my personal life, but you can actually see on these tests where you're improving. And they usually recommend that you do it like once a year. Okay, so that is stress management. So that's all of it. That's basically a high level overview of all of it. Like I said, I do offer private consultations. Basically, the way that looks is once you sign up for a consultation, you get a link in your email and you take the test. And then what that does is sends all the information to me. I create a 30-page report, and then we sit down and go over that. And it gives you a big overview of where you're good, where you need to improve. And it's what I love about it is it creates these stories, and you read it and you're like, that is so me. How does it know? Because the test that they created just interweaves so well that it's able to really give you a big picture of who you are, and then even your employees. So private consultation, you get the test. That's something that you keep. People do it once a year. But I'm also doing these for companies as well. What's cool about a company doing it is that each person individually takes it, but it also gives you an overview of whether the whole company needs to work on empathy, whether the whole company needs to work on stress management. And what I do, because I lead retreats and workshops, is when I do companies and say they need to work on empathy, I'll create workshops around what that particular company needs versus just anything. So if the empathy is low, we do workshops on that. So that's not what today was about. Today was very much for you guys to learn about what emotional intelligence is. I'm so passionate about this, people learning it and applying it in their workplace, in their homes. There's tons of books. There's tons of information. All you have to do is Google emotional intelligence and you'll find it. But if you have any questions or want to talk more about it, please feel free to reach out. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the year and can't wait for 2021. Thanks.